The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over downtown Springfield, casting harsh shadows between the rows of brick buildings that lined Commerce Street. The heat shimmered off the asphalt like waves, making the air thick and oppressive. It was the kind of day where tempers ran short and patience wore thin, where small incidents could explode into something much larger. Terrence Washington stepped out of his black BMW, the leather seats still cool from the air conditioning. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had built something from nothing. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly across his broad shoulders, and his polished leather shoes clicked against the pavement as he walked toward the building that had been his pride and joy for the past 8 years. The Washington building stood 3 stories tall, its red brick facade recently renovated to maintain the historical charm while housing modern businesses. The ground floor housed Sterling Electronics, a popular electronics store that had been Terrence's first major commercial tenant. The second floor contained a law office and accounting firm, while the third floor held his own property management company offices. Terrence owned not just this building, but 4 others along this stretch of Commerce Street. He was one of the most successful black business owners in Springfield, though he preferred to let his work speak for itself rather than seeking recognition. Today, he was making his regular monthly visit to check on his tenants and ensure everything was running smoothly. As he approached the entrance to Sterling Electronics, he could hear raised voices from inside. Through the large windows, he could see 2 police officers standing near the counter, their presence immediately putting him on alert. In his experience, police in his establishments usually meant trouble, and not always the kind that required law enforcement. Officer David Harrison stood with his thumbs hooked in his duty belt, his pale face flushed red from the heat and what appeared to be frustration. His partner, Officer Mike Sullivan, was shorter and stockier, with small eyes that darted around the store suspiciously. Both men had been on the Springfield Police Department for over a decade, and both had reputations in the community that preceded them. Lisa Chen, the young Asian-American store manager, stood behind the counter looking increasingly uncomfortable. She was trying to explain something to the officers, but Harrison kept cutting her off with dismissive hand gestures. "Ma'am, I don't care what your company policy says," Harrison was saying, his voice loud enough to carry through the glass door. "We got a call about suspicious activity, and we're going to investigate it properly." Lisa's voice was strained as she replied, "Officer, I've already explained that Mr. Washington owns this building. He has every right to be here. There's been no suspicious activity." "Right," Sullivan scoffed, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Some guy in a fancy suit owns this whole building. You sure he didn't just tell you that?" Terrence felt his jaw tighten as he listened to the exchange. He'd dealt with skepticism before about his success, but it never got easier to hear. He took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and pushed open the door to his own building. The electronic chime announced his entrance, and all 3 pairs of eyes turned toward him. Lisa's face showed visible relief, while the 2 officers immediately assumed more aggressive postures. "Good afternoon, Lisa," Terrence said calmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being in charge. "Is everything all right here?" Before Lisa could respond, Harrison stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his duty belt. "Sir, I need you to step back outside. We're conducting an investigation here." Terrence raised an eyebrow, his expression remaining calm despite the officer's hostile tone. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some misunderstanding. This is my building. I'm Terrence Washington, the owner." Sullivan let out a harsh laugh. "Yeah, right, buddy. And I'm the mayor of Springfield. You need to move along before we have to make you move along." The threat hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. Lisa stepped forward, her voice urgent. "Officers, please. This really is Mr. Washington. He owns this building and 4 others on this street. I can show you the lease agreements, the business licenses." "Nobody asked you," Harrison snapped at Lisa, causing her to recoil as if she'd been slapped. He turned back to Terrence, his pale blue eyes cold and calculating. "I don't know what game you're playing, friend, but you need to take it somewhere else. This is a legitimate business establishment, not some place for people like you to hang around causing trouble." The words, "people like you," landed like a physical blow, but Terence had learned long ago not to let his anger show on his face. Instead, he reached slowly into his jacket pocket, moving deliberately to avoid any misinterpretation of his actions. "Officer," he said, his voice steady, "I'm going to show you my identification and the building ownership documents. Everything is going to be very clear once you see—" "Don't reach for anything," Harrison barked, his hand moving to his holster. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The absurdity of the situation would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. Here was Terence standing in his own property, being treated like a criminal for the crime of existing while black in his own space. He slowly raised his hands, the leather folder containing his identification and building documents still clutched in his right hand. "Officer Harrison," Lisa said, her voice shaking now, "please, you're making a mistake. Mr. Washington has been my landlord for 3 years. He's here every month to check on the building. The other tenants all know him." Sullivan wheeled around to face Lisa, his face contorted with anger. "Lady, I told you to keep quiet. We'll handle this situation. You don't know what kind of con artists are out there, pretending to be something they're not." "Con artist?" Terence repeated, his composure finally beginning to crack. "For owning real estate? For visiting my own property?" "Your property?" Harrison laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Right. Let me guess. You're going to tell me you've got papers proving you own half the downtown area too." The door chimed again as 2 customers entered the store, an elderly white couple who immediately sensed the tension. They stopped just inside the entrance, their faces showing confusion and concern as they took in the scene. 2 police officers confronting a well-dressed black man while a frightened young woman cowered behind the counter. "Folks, you need to come back later," Sullivan announced to the couple. "We're dealing with a trespassing situation here." "Trespassing?" the elderly man asked, looking confused. "But isn't that Mr. Washington? He owns this building." Harrison's face darkened further. "Sir, please step outside. This man is not the owner of anything. He's causing a disturbance and refusing to leave when asked." The elderly woman looked from Terence to the officers, her weathered face creasing with concern. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. That's definitely Mr. Washington. He helped us when our air conditioner broke in our apartment upstairs last year. He's our landlord." "Ma'am," Harrison said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone, "I understand these criminals can be very convincing, but I assure you this man is not who he claims to be. Now please, for your own safety, step outside." Terence watched in amazement as the situation spiraled completely out of control. He was being called a criminal and a con artist in his own building by officers who refused to even look at the documentation that would immediately prove his identity. "Officers," he said, trying one more time to inject reason into the situation, "if you would just allow me to show you my identification." "I said don't reach for anything," Harrison shouted, his weapon now partially drawn. "Turn around and put your hands on the wall." The elderly couple gasped, the woman clutching her husband's arm. Lisa looked like she might faint, her face pale with shock. The scene had escalated from absurd to genuinely terrifying in a matter of minutes. Terence felt the familiar weight of injustice settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. He had faced this kind of treatment before, though never in such an extreme form, and certainly never in his own property. But he also knew that arguing with armed officers who had already decided he was guilty of something could end very badly for him. "I'm complying with your request," he said clearly, turning toward the wall while keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "But I want it on record that I am the legal owner of this building, and I have done absolutely nothing wrong." "Save it for the judge," Sullivan sneered, moving forward with handcuffs ready. As the cold metal closed around Terence's wrists, he caught sight of his reflection in the store window, a successful businessman reduced to a criminal in his own property by officers who couldn't see past the color of his skin. But as the cuffs clicked into place, Terence wasn't thinking about the humiliation or the injustice. He was thinking about what these officers didn't know about him and what they were about to learn. The story of how a simple property inspection became a fight for dignity was just beginning, and Terrence Washington was far from finished. The handcuffs bit into Terrence Washington's wrists as Officer Harrison roughly guided him toward the door of Sterling Electronics. The metal was warm from the afternoon heat, and the cuffs were deliberately tightened just enough to cause discomfort without leaving visible marks. It was a technique Harrison had perfected over his years on the force, a way of asserting dominance while maintaining plausible deniability. "Officer, please," Lisa Chen called out from behind the counter, her voice cracking with emotion. "You're making a terrible mistake. Mr. Washington really does own this building. I can call the other tenants to verify." "Lady, one more word out of you and we'll charge you with interfering with a police investigation," Sullivan barked over his shoulder as he followed his partner and Terrence toward the exit. The elderly couple who had attempted to enter the store pressed themselves against the glass door as the officers approached. The woman's eyes were wide with shock as she watched a man she had known as her helpful landlord being arrested like a common criminal. "Officer Harrison," the elderly man said, his voice trembling slightly, "this really is Mr. Washington. He owns our apartment building, too. There's some kind of misunderstanding here." Harrison paused at the door, his face flushed red with irritation. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to step aside. This individual has been trespassing and causing a disturbance. Don't let his appearance fool you. Criminals come in all shapes and sizes these days." Terrence turned his head slightly, meeting the elderly man's eyes. "Mr. Peterson, isn't it? Apartment 3B in the Morrison building?" Despite his situation, Terrence's voice remained calm and professional. "How is Mrs. Peterson feeling after her surgery last month?" The old man's face crumpled with anguish. "She's doing much better, Mr. Washington. Thank you for asking." "Officer, please, this man visited my wife in the hospital. He reduced our rent when I couldn't work. He's not a criminal." "Enough!" Harrison shouted, shoving Terrence harder toward the door. "I don't care what sob story he's got you believing. Move aside, now!" As they pushed through the door and onto the sidewalk, the late afternoon heat hit them like a physical blow. The Commerce Street corridor was busy with foot traffic, and the sight of a well-dressed black man in handcuffs immediately drew attention. Pedestrians slowed their pace, some pulling out phones to record the scene. Terrence had built his reputation in this community over years of hard work and fair dealing. Now he watched that reputation being torn down in real time as people he knew, some he'd helped, others he'd done business with, stared in shock and confusion. "Keep moving," Sullivan muttered, pushing Terrence toward their patrol car parked directly in front of the building. As they walked, Terrence noticed something that made his jaw tighten with anger. The patrol car was parked in a clearly marked no parking zone directly in front of his building. There was a perfectly legal parking spot just 20 feet away, but the officers had chosen to park illegally, blocking the entrance to his property and creating an obstruction for both pedestrians and other vehicles. "You're parked in a no parking zone," Terrence observed, his voice carrying just a hint of the authority he was accustomed to using in his business dealings. Harrison stopped abruptly and spun around to face him. "What did you say?" "I said you're parked illegally," Terrence repeated, nodding toward the clearly visible signs. "This is a no parking zone during business hours. The spots 20 feet down are legal parking." "Are you giving me a lesson in traffic law?" Harrison's voice was dangerously low, his face inches from Terrence's. "Maybe you didn't understand your situation here, friend. You don't get to tell officers where to park." "I'm not telling you anything," Terrence replied evenly. "I'm pointing out that you're blocking access to a commercial building while investigating what you claim is trespassing in that same building." The logic of his statement only seemed to enrage Harrison further. The officer's hand moved to his baton, fingers wrapping around the handle in a gesture that was clearly meant to intimidate. Sullivan opened the back door of the patrol car, the hinges creaking in the afternoon heat. "Get in," he commanded, placing his hand on Terrence's head to guide him into the vehicle. As Terrence ducked into the back seat, he caught sight of Jerome Martinez approaching from across the street. Jerome was one of his tenants, a young lawyer who rented office space on the second floor of the Washington building. His face showed confusion and alarm as he took in the scene. "Mr. Washington?" Jerome called out, breaking into a jog as he crossed the street. "What's going on here?" Harrison slammed the car door shut, trapping Terrence inside before turning to face the approaching lawyer. "Sir, stay back. This is police business." Jerome slowed his approach, but didn't stop. He was young, maybe 30, with the clean-cut appearance of someone who spent his days in courtrooms. His dark hair was neatly styled, and his charcoal suit marked him as a professional. "Officer, I'm Jerome Martinez. I'm an attorney, and that man is my landlord. There has to be some mistake here." "Another one," Sullivan muttered under his breath, though loud enough for Jerome to hear. Jerome's eyebrows shot up. "Excuse me?" "Nothing, counselor," Harrison said, his tone mocking. "Just seems like this guy has convinced a lot of people he's something he's not." From inside the patrol car, Terrence watched the exchange with growing frustration. The windows were rolled up, and the heat was already becoming stifling. He could see Jerome's mouth moving as he spoke with the officers, but couldn't make out the words clearly. Jerome pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. "Officer, I'm going to call my office and have them fax over a copy of our lease agreement. Mr. Washington's signature is on file, along with copies of his business licenses and building ownership documents." "Put the phone away," Harrison commanded, his hand moving toward his weapon again. "This individual has been arrested for trespassing and disturbing the peace. If you interfere with this arrest, you'll be joining him." Jerome's face hardened with professional determination. "Officer, I need your badge number and the badge number of your partner. This arrest is being made without probable cause, and I intend to file a formal complaint." "My badge number?" Harrison laughed harshly. "Let me give you some free legal advice, counselor. Mind your own business before you find yourself in trouble, too." The threat was clear, but Jerome didn't back down. Instead, he held up his phone and began recording. "I'm documenting this interaction for legal purposes. You are arresting Mr. Terrence Washington, the legal owner of this property, without cause and refusing to examine evidence that would verify his identity." Sullivan moved toward Jerome aggressively. "Turn off that camera right now, or we'll confiscate it as evidence." "You have no legal authority to confiscate my phone for recording a public arrest," Jerome replied firmly, though Terrence could see his hand trembling slightly as he held the device. Inside the patrol car, Terrence felt a mix of gratitude and concern as he watched Jerome stand up for him. The young lawyer was risking his own safety to document the injustice, but Terrence also knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. The crowd that had gathered was growing larger, with more phones appearing to record the confrontation. Terrence could see several faces he recognized, customers from various businesses he owned, tenants from his apartment buildings, and community members who knew him as a successful businessman and property owner. Harrison seemed to realize that the situation was spiraling beyond his control. The presence of cameras and witnesses was clearly making him uncomfortable, and his earlier confidence was being replaced by visible agitation. "Everyone needs to disperse immediately," Harrison announced to the growing crowd. "This is an active police investigation, and anyone who interferes will be arrested for obstruction." "Investigation of what?" called out a voice from the crowd. "That's Mr. Washington. He owns half the buildings on this street." "Yeah," another voice joined in. "He's my landlord, too. What's he supposed to have done?" The murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered crowd, and Terrence could see the officers exchanging nervous glances. What had started as a simple arrest based on their assumptions was turning into a public relations nightmare. Jerome continued recording, his voice clear and professional as he narrated what was happening. "The time is approximately 4:30 p.m. on Commerce Street. Officers have arrested Mr. Terrence Washington, a prominent local business owner, for alleged trespassing in his own building. Multiple witnesses have identified Mr. Washington as the property owner, but officers have refused to examine documentation that would verify his identity." "Turn off that damn camera," Sullivan shouted, moving aggressively toward Jerome. "Officer, you are being recorded in a public space during the performance of your official duties," Jerome replied steadily. I have every legal right to document this arrest. Harrison made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. Instead of de-escalating the situation or taking a moment to verify Terrence's identity, he chose to double down on his mistake. "Load him up," he told Sullivan curtly. "We're taking him in. Everyone else needs to clear the area now, or you'll be arrested for unlawful assembly." As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Terrence caught one last glimpse of the crowd through the rear window. Jerome was still recording, his face grim with professional determination. Lisa Chen had emerged from the electronics store and was talking animatedly with several people, presumably explaining what had happened inside. But what the officers didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that their decision to arrest Terrence Washington would set off a chain of events that would reach far beyond Springfield's city limits. Because Terrence Washington wasn't just a successful businessman and property owner. He was also a man with connections, resources, and a story that would soon capture the attention of the entire nation. The Springfield Police Department booking area smelled like disinfectant and desperation, a combination of harsh chemicals and the lingering odors of countless individuals who had passed through its doors over the years. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly greenish tint that made even healthy people look pale and drawn. Terrence Washington sat on a hard metal bench, still in his handcuffs, watching as Officer Sullivan completed paperwork at a scarred wooden desk. The booking process had been deliberately slow, each step drawn out with unnecessary delays and bureaucratic obstacles. It was clear that the officers were hoping to keep him detained long enough for their version of events to solidify into official record before any inconvenient facts could surface. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man named Bob Crawford with 23 years on the force, barely glanced up as Harrison approached with a folder in his hand. Crawford had seen it all during his tenure, and one more arrest hardly registered on his consciousness. "What do we got, Harrison?" Crawford asked, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone going through familiar motions. "Trespassing and disturbing the peace," Harrison replied, setting the folder down with more force than necessary. Guy was causing problems at Sterling Electronics on Commerce Street. Refused to leave when asked, got belligerent with the officers. Crawford's pen moved mechanically across the forms, filling in blanks without really processing the information. It was just another day, another arrest, another piece of paperwork to be shuffled through the system. "Any priors?" Crawford asked routinely. "Haven't run him yet," Sullivan answered, joining them at the desk. "But you know how it is. Guys like this, there's always something." From his position on the bench, Terrence listened to the casual conversation about his life and character with growing anger. These men were discussing him like he was a statistic, a stereotype to be filed away rather than a human being with rights and dignity. "I'd like to make my phone call now," Terrence said, his voice carrying across the booking area with quiet authority. Crawford looked up from his paperwork for the first time, taking in Terrence's expensive suit and professional demeanor with mild interest. "Phone call comes after processing is complete," he said automatically. "How much longer is processing going to take?" Terrence asked. "I've been here for over an hour, and you haven't even taken my fingerprints yet." Harrison stepped forward, his face flushing with anger. "You'll get your phone call when we say you get your phone call. Until then, keep your mouth shut." The booking area fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of radio chatter from the main desk. Terrence met Harrison's gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated despite his precarious situation. Crawford, sensing the tension, decided to move things along. "All right, let's get this wrapped up. Sullivan, take him for prints and photos. Harrison, finish the paperwork." 20 minutes later, Terrence stood at a grimy payphone mounted on the wall near the holding cells. His fingertips were still stained black with ink, and the bright camera flash had left spots dancing in his vision. He had been allowed one phone call, and he intended to make it count. He dialed a number from memory, one he hadn't used in over 6 months, but knew would still be active. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Denise Parker speaking." Denise, it's Terrence Washington. There was a brief pause, followed by surprise and concern. Terrence? What's wrong? You sound strange. Denise Parker was more than just a friend to Terrence. She was an investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune with a national reputation for exposing corruption and civil rights violations. They had met during college and maintained their friendship through the years, despite taking very different career paths. I'm calling from the Springfield Police Department, Terrence said, keeping his voice low. I've been arrested. Arrested? Denise's voice sharpened with professional interest. For what? Trespassing and disturbing the peace, Terrence replied, in my own building. Even through the poor connection of the jail phone, he could hear Denise's sharp intake of breath. She knew exactly what he meant, and the implications were immediately clear to her. Tell me everything, she said, and he could hear the sound of her fingers already moving across a keyboard. Terrence quickly outlined the events of the afternoon, from his arrival at Sterling Electronics to his arrest despite multiple witnesses verifying his identity. He described the officers' refusal to examine his identification, their dismissive attitude toward the witnesses, and their escalation of a simple misunderstanding into a criminal arrest. Do you have documentation of the building ownership? Denise asked. Of course. It's all in my briefcase in my car, which is still parked outside the building. I also have copies of everything in my office upstairs, along with tax records, business licenses, and insurance documents, but they wouldn't let me show them anything. Denise was quiet for a moment, and Terrence could almost hear her mind working. She had built her career on stories like this, cases where institutional racism and police misconduct intersected with real consequences for real people. Terrence, she said finally, what you're describing isn't just a simple mistake. This is a federal civil rights violation. Are you injured? Did they use excessive force? No physical injuries, Terrence replied, but the handcuffs were deliberately tight and they made sure the arrest was as public and humiliating as possible. I need you to listen carefully, Denise said, her voice taking on the urgent tone she used when working on a major story. Don't say anything else to anyone without a lawyer present. I'm going to make some calls. How long do you think you'll be held? Before Terrence could answer, Officer Harrison appeared beside him, his hand reaching for the phone. Time's up. I have to go, Terrence said quickly into the phone. But Denise, there's something else you should know. The officers parked illegally to make this arrest, and there were multiple witnesses recording the whole thing. I'm on my way to Springfield, Denise said, her words rushing to beat Harrison's inevitable disconnection of the call. Don't talk to anyone until I get there. Harrison yanked the phone from Terrence's hand and slammed it back onto the wall mount. Back to the holding cell, he ordered, grabbing Terrence's arm with unnecessary force. As Terrence was led back toward the cells, he felt a sense of calm settle over him for the first time since his arrest. Denise Parker wasn't just any journalist. She had contacts throughout the legal system, law enforcement, and civil rights organizations. More importantly, she had a track record of turning local incidents into national news when justice demanded it. What Harrison and Sullivan didn't know was that their afternoon of power and intimidation had just attracted the attention of someone with the skills and connections to expose their actions to a much larger audience. 2 hours later, Denise Parker was driving south on Interstate 55, her car loaded with recording equipment and a briefcase full of research she had already begun compiling on the Springfield Police Department. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since she left Chicago, as word of the story began to spread through her network of contacts. Meanwhile, back at the Springfield jail, Terrence Washington sat in his holding cell, still wearing his expensive suit, now wrinkled and stained from the booking process. He wasn't thinking about the discomfort or the indignity of his situation. He was thinking about the system that had allowed this to happen and the opportunity he now had to expose it for what it really was. The officers thought they were dealing with just another black man they could push around and intimidate. They had no idea that their actions were about to become the subject of national scrutiny, or that the man they had arrested possessed resources and connections far beyond their comprehension. As the sun set over Springfield, casting long shadows through the jail's barred windows, Terrence Washington waited patiently for the storm that was coming. Because sometimes justice doesn't just happen in courtrooms. Sometimes it happens in the court of public opinion, where the truth has a way of cutting through lies like a hot knife through butter. And the truth was about to be unleashed. By 8 o'clock that evening, the Springfield Police Department was experiencing something it had never dealt with before, a media firestorm. The first call came from a stringer for the Chicago Tribune, followed quickly by inquiries from local television stations, radio producers, and bloggers who had caught wind of the story through social media. Chief Robert Sterling sat in his office, his tie loosened and his shirt sleeves rolled up, staring at his computer screen in disbelief. His email inbox was flooded with media requests, and his phone had been ringing non-stop for the past hour. The chief was a 25-year veteran of law enforcement, but he had never seen a simple arrest generate this kind of attention this quickly. The story had exploded online after Jerome Martinez, the young lawyer who had witnessed the arrest, posted his video footage to social media platforms. Within hours, the video had been shared thousands of times, with comments ranging from outrage to disbelief. The hashtag #Justice for Terrence was already trending locally, and national civil rights organizations were beginning to take notice. Sterling picked up his phone and dialed the extension for the booking desk. "Crawford, I need to see the paperwork on the Washington arrest, and I need it now." 10 minutes later, Sergeant Crawford knocked on the chief's door, a manila folder tucked under his arm. His usually confident demeanor was replaced by visible nervousness as he entered the office. "Sir, here's the file on the Washington arrest," Crawford said, placing the folder on Sterling's desk. The chief opened the folder and began reading, his expression growing darker with each page. The arrest report was thin, lacking the detailed documentation that typically accompanied legitimate trespassing charges. The officer's statements were vague, filled with subjective language about suspicious behavior and disturbing the peace, without specific facts to support the charges. "Crawford," Sterling said slowly, looking up from the paperwork, "tell me you've verified this man's identity." Crawford shifted uncomfortably. "Well, sir, we ran his driver's license. Clean record, no priors. But Harrison and Sullivan were pretty certain about what they saw." "What they saw," Sterling repeated, his voice flat. "And what exactly did they see that justified arresting a man for trespassing in a building he supposedly owns?" "Well, sir, they said he was acting suspicious, refusing to leave when asked." Sterling held up a hand to stop him. "Have we confirmed whether or not he actually owns the building?" The silence that followed answered the chief's question more effectively than words could have. "Get me Harrison and Sullivan in here right now," Sterling commanded, his voice taking on the hard edge that his officers knew meant serious trouble. Chief Sterling was dealing with the administrative fallout. Denise Parker had arrived in Springfield and was already working her contacts. She had checked into the Hampton Inn just off the interstate and immediately set up what she called her mobile newsroom in her hotel suite. Her laptop was connected to a portable printer, her recording equipment was charged and ready, and her phone was cycling through calls to sources throughout Illinois and beyond. By 10 o'clock that evening, she had already conducted preliminary interviews with 3 witnesses to the arrest, obtained copies of the social media videos, and begun researching the backgrounds of officers Harrison and Sullivan. What she found in that research would have shocked even seasoned investigators. Officer David Harrison had been the subject of 7 formal complaints during his 11-year career with the Springfield Police Department. The complaints ranged from excessive force to racial profiling, though none had resulted in significant disciplinary action. His personnel file showed a pattern of aggressive behavior, particularly in interactions with minority citizens, that had been consistently overlooked or minimized by department supervisors. Officer Mike Sullivan's record was similarly troubling. In his 9 years with the department, he had been involved in 3 use-of-force incidents that had resulted in civil lawsuits against the city. 2 of those cases had been settled out of court for undisclosed amounts, and the third was still pending. Most damaging of all, Denise discovered that both officers had been participants in a training program that had been discontinued by the department after complaints about its emphasis on aggressive tactics and its treatment of community policing as weakness rather than strength. At 11 p.m., Denise's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she recognized immediately. "This is Denise." "Ms. Parker, this is Attorney Jerome Martinez. I witnessed Mr. Washington's arrest this afternoon, and I understand you're investigating the story." "Mr. Martinez, yes. I'd like to interview you as soon as possible. Are you available tonight?" "I'm available now," Jerome replied, "and I have something you need to see." 30 minutes later, Jerome sat across from Denise in her hotel suite, his laptop open on the small table between them. His video footage of the arrest played on the screen, but he had enhanced it with editing software that allowed them to hear conversations that weren't clearly audible in the raw footage. "Listen to this part," Jerome said, adjusting the audio levels. The enhanced sound revealed Officer Harrison's voice clearly. "Right. Some guy in a fancy suit owns this whole building. You sure he didn't just tell you that?" Denise leaned forward, her experienced ear catching the sarcasm and dismissiveness in the officer's tone. "Can you enhance the audio from when Mr. Washington first entered the building?" Jerome nodded, jumping to an earlier section of the video. The enhanced audio revealed Terrence's calm, professional introduction of himself, followed by Sullivan's mocking laughter and his comment, "Yeah, right, buddy, and I'm the mayor of Springfield." "This is devastating," Denise said, making notes in her reporter's notebook. "They didn't just refuse to believe him, they mocked him for claiming to own the property." "It gets worse," Jerome said, jumping to another section. "Listen to what Harrison says when the elderly couple tries to verify Mr. Washington's identity." The enhanced audio revealed Harrison's dismissive response. "Ma'am, I understand these criminals can be very convincing, but I assure you this man is not who he claims to be." Denise sat back in her chair, the full scope of the story becoming clear to her. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity or poor police work. This was a clear example of racial profiling that had escalated into a civil rights violation, captured on video with crystal-clear audio evidence. "Mr. Martinez," she said, looking up from her notes, "I need you to understand something. This story is going to explode nationally. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" Jerome nodded grimly. "Ms. Parker, I became a lawyer to fight injustice. If exposing this helps prevent it from happening to someone else, then I'm ready for whatever comes." As midnight approached, Denise was putting the finishing touches on her initial article. Her editor at the Chicago Tribune had already cleared space on the front page of the morning edition, and the story was being prepared for simultaneous release online. The headline read, "Prominent black business owner arrested for trespassing in his own building as police ignore multiple witnesses." But even as Denise worked to craft the story that would bring national attention to Terrence Washington's case, she knew this was just the beginning. The real story wasn't just about one man's arrest. It was about a system that allowed such arrests to happen and the communities that suffered the consequences. Meanwhile, back at the Springfield Police Department, Officers Harrison and Sullivan sat in Chief Sterling's office, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. The chief had spent the last hour reviewing their arrest report, comparing it with witness statements and social media videos, and the picture that emerged was not flattering to his department. "Gentlemen," Chief Sterling said, his voice carefully controlled, "help me understand how two experienced officers could arrest a property owner for trespassing in his own building without bothering to verify his identity." Harrison shifted in his chair, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Chief, the guy was acting suspicious. He seemed out of place." "Out of place," Sterling repeated slowly. "In his own building, wearing a business suit, during business hours." Sullivan attempted to defend their actions. "Chief, you know how these scam artists operate. They come up with elaborate stories." Sterling's hand slammed down on his desk, causing both officers to jump. "Stop talking, both of you, before you dig this hole any deeper." The chief stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the parking lot where news vans were already beginning to gather despite the late hour. He had received calls from the mayor, the city attorney, and 3 different civil rights organizations in the past 2 hours. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Sterling asked, turning back to face them. "Do you understand the position you've put this department in?" Both officers remained silent, finally beginning to grasp the magnitude of their mistake. "Here's what's going to happen," Sterling continued. "You're both suspended pending a full investigation. Internal Affairs will be conducting interviews with all witnesses, and I suspect the FBI Civil Rights Division won't be far behind." Harrison's face went pale. "Chief, that seems like an overreaction." "An overreaction?" Sterling's voice rose for the first time. "You arrested a prominent businessman in his own property, ignored multiple witnesses who tried to verify his identity, and did it all in front of cameras. The video of your arrest is being viewed by thousands of people right now, and by tomorrow morning it'll be national news." The chief returned to his seat, his expression grim. "Get out of my office, and don't talk to any reporters, don't post anything on social media, and don't discuss this case with anyone except your lawyers. Because trust me, you're going to need them." As Harrison and Sullivan filed out of the office, Chief Sterling picked up his phone to call the mayor. It was going to be a very long night and an even longer week ahead. Back in his holding cell, Terrence Washington sat quietly on the narrow cot, his expensive suit now wrinkled beyond recognition. He could hear the increased activity in the police station, more voices, more phone calls, more urgent conversations in the hallways. He had been in difficult situations before, but never one quite like this. The irony wasn't lost on him that his success and community standing, the very things that should have protected him from this kind of treatment, had instead made his arrest more newsworthy and therefore more damaging to the officers involved. At 1 a.m., a guard appeared at his cell door with a clipboard. "Washington, you've made bail. Someone posted it an hour ago." Terrence stood slowly, straightening his tie as best he could. "Who posted bail?" "Doesn't say here," the guard replied, unlocking the cell door. "Just says bail has been posted and you're free to go." As Terrence walked through the booking area toward the exit, he noticed several people he didn't recognize standing near the front desk. Reporters, he realized, recognizing the notebooks and recording devices that marked their profession. The desk sergeant handed him a manila envelope containing his personal effects, wallet, keys, phone, and the business documents that officers had refused to examine earlier in the day. "Your car is still parked on Commerce Street," the sergeant said without making eye contact. "Hasn't been towed yet." Terrence nodded and walked toward the exit, the small group of reporters turning to follow him. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, camera flashes began popping, and voices called out questions he wasn't ready to answer. "Mr. Washington, how do you feel about your arrest? Are you planning to file a lawsuit against the city? Do you think this was racially motivated?" Terrence paused on the steps of the police station, looking out at the small crowd that had gathered despite the late hour. Some faces were familiar: community members, business associates, people whose lives he had touched in some way over the years. But he also saw strangers, people who had come out because they recognized the injustice of what had happened, even if they didn't know him personally. "I'll have a statement tomorrow," Terrence said simply, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had served him well in business. "Right now, I just want to go home." As he walked toward the taxi that someone had apparently called for him, Terrence reflected on the events of the day. What had started as a routine visit to check on his property had turned into something much larger, a spotlight on issues that went far beyond one man's wrongful arrest. The real story was just beginning, and Terrence Washington was ready to tell it. The morning sun cast long shadows across Commerce Street as news vans lined both sides of the road like mechanical vultures waiting for their next meal. By 7 a.m., 3 local television stations, 2 radio broadcasters, and correspondents from Chicago and St. Louis had set up temporary headquarters in the parking lot across from the Washington building. Terrence Washington stood at the window of his third-floor office, looking down at the media circus below. He had managed only 3 hours of sleep, but his mind was clear and focused. He wore a fresh charcoal gray suit, his appearance once again impeccable despite the ordeal of the previous day. Jerome Martinez knocked on the open office door, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a folder thick with legal documents. The young lawyer had arrived early, anticipating that Terrence would want to begin preparing their response to the arrest. "The media's been calling since 5 this morning," Jerome said, handing Terrence a coffee cup. "Channel 6, Channel 12, the Tribune, the Register, and about 6 other outlets I've never heard of." Terrence accepted the coffee gratefully, taking a sip before responding. "What about the police department? Any word from them?" "Chief Sterling called my office 20 minutes ago," Jerome replied, opening his folder. "He wants to meet with you today. Unofficially, he says. No lawyers, no media, just a conversation." "What do you think?" Terrence asked, though his tone suggested he had already made up his mind. "I think Chief Sterling is in damage control mode," Jerome said bluntly. "The story broke nationally this morning. Denise Parker's article is being picked up by news outlets across the country, and the hashtag is trending on multiple social media platforms." Terrence moved away from the window and sat behind his desk, the familiar surroundings helping to ground him after the chaos of the previous day. This office had been his sanctuary for 8 years, the place where he had built his business empire and planned his community investments. "Jerome, I want you to understand something," Terrence said, his voice taking on the measured tone he used for important business decisions. "This isn't just about me anymore. What happened yesterday happens to people every day, people who don't have my resources or connections. If we don't handle this right, it becomes just another news story that fades away in a week." Jerome nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility his client was feeling. "What do you want to do?" Before Terrence could answer, his secretary knocked on the doorframe. Keisha Johnson had worked for him for 5 years, managing his schedule and handling the day-to-day operations of his property management company. She was a single mother in her 30s, working her way through night school to earn her business degree. "Mr. Washington," Keisha said, her voice tight with emotion, "there's a crowd gathering downstairs. Community members, business owners, tenants from your buildings. They want to show their support." Terrence walked back to the window and looked down. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Nearly 50 people had gathered on the sidewalk in front of his building, holding signs and banners with messages of support. He recognized many of the faces: the elderly couple from the previous day, several of his tenants, business owners from neighboring buildings, and community members he had helped over the years. One banner particularly caught his attention: "Terrence Washington, our neighbor, our landlord, our friend." "They've been arriving for the past hour," Keisha continued. "Mrs. Peterson from the Morrison building organized it through the Tenants Association. She said people needed to see that you have community support." Jerome joined Terrence at the window, both men watching as more people arrived to join the growing demonstration. "This is powerful," Jerome said quietly. "This kind of community response can't be manufactured or bought." A knock at the door interrupted them. Denise Parker stood in the doorway, her press credentials hanging around her neck and her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. She looked like she hadn't slept much either, but her eyes were bright with the intensity of a reporter who knew she was onto something big. "Mr. Washington," Denise said, "I'm Denise Parker from the Tribune. We spoke on the phone yesterday." Terrence turned from the window, extending his hand to shake hers. "Ms. Parker, thank you for coming. I understand your article is causing quite a stir." "It's being shared across the country," Denise confirmed. "I've been contacted by CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News for follow-up interviews. This story has touched a nerve." She pulled out her recorder and notebook, settling into one of the chairs facing Terrence's desk. "I'd like to do a more comprehensive interview with you. Get your perspective on what happened and what you think it means for the broader community." Terrence glanced at Jerome, who nodded encouragingly. "Ms. Parker, before we begin, I want you to understand my position. This isn't about revenge or personal vindication. This is about accountability and making sure this doesn't happen to others. I understand, Denise replied, turning on her recorder. Let's start with yesterday. Tell me about your relationship with this community and why you were at Sterling Electronics. For the next 45 minutes, Terrence laid out his story in detail. He described his journey from a young man with limited resources to a successful property owner and community leader. He talked about his philosophy of reinvestment in neighborhoods that others had abandoned and his commitment to providing quality housing and commercial space at fair prices. I've been arrested once before in my life, Terrence said, his voice steady despite the painful memory. I was 19, protesting outside a segregated lunch counter in Memphis. The officer who arrested me told me I was causing trouble where I didn't belong. Yesterday, 42-year-old me was told the same thing by officers who couldn't believe I belonged in my own building. Denise leaned forward, her pen moving rapidly across her notebook. What do you think needs to happen now? Accountability, Terrence replied without hesitation. Not just for the officers involved, but for the system that allowed this to happen. How many complaints had been filed against these officers before? How many other people have been treated this way who didn't have witnesses and cameras to document it? As the interview concluded, Keisha knocked again. Mr. Washington, the crowd downstairs is getting larger. Channel 6 wants to know if you'll make a statement. Terrence looked out the window again. The crowd had indeed grown, now numbering close to 100 people. He could see several of his business tenants had closed their shops early to join the demonstration, and a group of high school students had arrived with homemade signs calling for justice. Jerome, Terrence said, making his decision. I want you to contact Chief Sterling. Tell him I'll meet with him, but not privately. Any conversation we have should be on the record, with media present. Jerome nodded, making notes. What about the crowd? Are you going to speak to them? Terrence straightened his tie and buttoned his suit jacket. Yes, they came here to support me. The least I can do is acknowledge their efforts. 10 minutes later, Terrence Washington stepped out of his building onto Commerce Street for the second time in 24 hours. This time, however, instead of being met with hostility and handcuffs, he was greeted with cheers and applause from a crowd of supporters. The media crews quickly repositioned their cameras and microphones as Terrence made his way to an impromptu speaking area that had been set up using milk crates as a platform. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. A successful businessman standing on milk crates to address his community, brought low by the very system that was supposed to protect him. Friends, Terrence began, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. Yesterday I experienced something that many of you have faced or fear facing. I was judged not by my character or my actions, but by assumptions based on my appearance. The crowd murmured agreement, several people nodding their heads in recognition. But I want you to know that what happened to me is not the end of this story. It's the beginning. We're going to use this incident to shine a light on problems that have existed in our community for too long. He paused, looking out over the sea of faces, young and old, various ethnicities united in their support for justice. I've been blessed with success and resources that many people don't have. I intend to use those blessings to ensure that what happened to me doesn't happen to others. We're going to demand accountability, not just for yesterday's arrest, but for the system that made it possible. The crowd erupted in cheers, signs waving in the air as people showed their approval of his words. But most importantly, Terrence continued, raising his hand to quiet the crowd, we're going to do this the right way. We're going to seek justice through legal channels, through community action, and through the power of truth. We're not going to let anger make us forget who we are or what we stand for. As applause filled the air, Terrence spotted a familiar figure at the edge of the crowd. Officer David Harrison stood next to an unmarked police car, his face pale as he took in the scene. Their eyes met across the crowd, and Terrence saw something in the officer's expression he hadn't seen the day before. Fear. The game had changed completely. What had started as two officers asserting their authority over a black man they assumed couldn't fight back had become a community rallying cry for justice and accountability. As Terrence stepped down from his makeshift platform and began greeting supporters, he knew that the real work was just beginning. The arrest had been one day, but the fight for justice would take much longer. But looking out at the faces of his community members, seeing their determination and support, Terrence Washington knew he wouldn't be fighting alone. 3 days after Terrence Washington's arrest, the Springfield City Hall conference room buzzed with tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Mayor Patricia Hendricks sat at the head of a long mahogany table, her usually perfect appearance showing signs of strain. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed the sleepless nights she'd endured since the story broke nationally. Around the table sat the key players in what had become Springfield's biggest crisis in decades: Chief Sterling, City Attorney Rebecca Lane, Public Relations Director Tom Bradley, and 2 FBI agents who had arrived from Chicago that morning. Special Agent Maria Santos was a 20-year veteran of the Bureau's Civil Rights Division, known for her meticulous investigations and unwillingness to be intimidated by local politics. Her partner, Agent Jack Reed, specialized in police misconduct cases and had a reputation for uncovering corruption that departments thought they had buried. "Let's be clear about where we stand," Mayor Hendricks began, her voice strained but controlled. "The FBI is here because this has become a federal civil rights investigation. The Justice Department is reviewing the case, and we have national media attention that shows no signs of diminishing." She slid a folder across the table. "Our legal department has reviewed the arrest, the witness statements, and the video evidence. Their conclusion is that we have significant exposure to civil rights violations, false arrest, and potential conspiracy charges." Chief Sterling shifted uncomfortably in his seat. In 3 days, his department had gone from a routine arrest to the subject of federal investigation. The personnel files of Harrison and Sullivan were spread across the table like evidence in a murder trial. "Chief Sterling," Agent Santos said, her voice professionally neutral, "we've reviewed the personnel files of both officers involved. Officer Harrison has 7 formal complaints over 11 years, and Officer Sullivan has 3 use-of-force incidents that resulted in lawsuits. Can you explain why these officers remained in active duty with this record?" Sterling's jaw tightened. "Agent Santos, every complaint was investigated according to department procedures. Some were sustained, others weren't. The officers received appropriate discipline when warranted." "Appropriate discipline," Agent Reed repeated, consulting his notes. "Officer Harrison received a 3-day suspension for excessive force in 2019. Officer Sullivan received a written reprimand for racial profiling in 2020. Yet both continued to work patrol with no additional oversight or retraining." The silence in the room was deafening. City Attorney Lane cleared her throat nervously before speaking. "The department followed established protocols for discipline and oversight. Protocols that allowed these officers to arrest a prominent businessman for trespassing in his own building," Agent Santos said bluntly. "Protocols that ignored multiple witnesses who attempted to verify his identity. Protocols that resulted in a man being handcuffed and jailed for the crime of being black in his own property." Mayor Hendricks rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of political and legal pressure mounting. "What does the Justice Department want from us?" Agent Reed opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick document. "The department is prepared to offer Springfield a consent decree. Federal oversight of your police department's policies, training, and disciplinary procedures. Mandatory bias training for all officers, independent oversight of use-of-force incidents, and a complete review of past complaints against Officers Harrison and Sullivan." "And if we refuse?" Chief Sterling asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Then you'll face federal prosecution for civil rights violations, and Mr. Washington's civil lawsuit will proceed without any cooperation from the Justice Department," Agent Santos replied matter-of-factly. Meanwhile, across town in his office, Terrence Washington was conducting his own investigation with the help of Jerome Martinez and a team of private investigators they had hired. The conference table in his office was covered with documents, photographs, and computer printouts that painted a disturbing picture of systemic problems within the Springfield Police Department. "What we're finding goes far beyond Harrison and Sullivan," Jerome reported, pointing to a timeline he had constructed on a whiteboard. "Over the past 5 years, there have been 43 complaints filed against Springfield police officers for racial bias, excessive force, or misconduct. Of those 43 complaints, only 7 resulted in any disciplinary action." Terrence studied the timeline, his business mind automatically looking for patterns. "What about lawsuits? How many cases has the city settled?" 12 in the past 5 years, Jerome replied, consulting his notes. "Total settlements of $2.3 million, all with confidentiality agreements that prevented the details from becoming public." Keisha Johnson, who had been researching news archives on her computer, looked up from her screen. "Mr. Washington, I found something else. 3 years ago, there was a complaint filed against Harrison by a black college student who claimed he was arrested for looking suspicious while waiting for a bus. The case was dismissed when the student couldn't afford a lawyer to fight it." Terrence felt a familiar anger building in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "Get me that student's name and contact information. I want to talk to him." The private investigator they had hired, a former police detective named Robert Hayes, entered the office carrying a box of files. Hayes was a white man in his 50s who had left the Chicago Police Department after becoming disgusted with the corruption he witnessed. "Mr. Washington," Hayes said, setting the box on the table, "I've been talking to current and former Springfield police officers. What I'm hearing isn't pretty." He pulled out a folder containing interview notes. "I spoke with 3 officers who were willing to talk off the record. They all described a culture in the department where aggressive policing in minority neighborhoods was encouraged, and officers who questioned these tactics were ostracized." "What about Harrison and Sullivan specifically?" Jerome asked. Hayes consulted his notes. "Both officers were part of a specialized unit that was disbanded 2 years ago after complaints about their methods. The unit was supposed to focus on drug enforcement, but witnesses describe it as basically harassment of young black men." Terrence stood and walked to his window, looking down at Commerce Street where life was slowly returning to normal. The media circus had moved on to other stories, but the impact of his arrest continued to reverberate through the community. "Robert," Terrence said, still looking out the window, "I want you to expand your investigation. I want to know about every complaint, every lawsuit, every incident involving these officers and others like them. If there's a pattern of misconduct, I want it documented." Hayes nodded grimly. "Mr. Washington, what you're talking about could expose corruption that goes all the way to the top of the department. Are you prepared for that kind of fight?" Terrence turned back to face the room, his expression resolute. "I'm prepared for whatever it takes to ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else." That afternoon, Denise Parker published her follow-up article in the Chicago Tribune. The headline read, "Springfield Police Department under federal investigation following wrongful arrest of black business owner." The article detailed the FBI's involvement, the consent decree negotiations, and the broader pattern of misconduct that was emerging from the investigation. The story was picked up by national news outlets within hours, and by evening, Terrence's arrest had become part of a larger national conversation about police reform and racial justice. But for all the media attention and political pressure, the most significant development was happening quietly in the offices of civil rights attorneys across the country. Other victims of police misconduct in Springfield were coming forward, emboldened by Terrence's willingness to fight the system. The college student who had been arrested for looking suspicious contacted Jerome's office. A Latino family whose home had been searched without a warrant reached out. A black teenager who had been stopped 17 times in 2 years for routine traffic violations asked for help. What had started as one man's wrongful arrest was becoming a reckoning for an entire police department. That evening, Terrence sat in his office long after his staff had gone home, reading through the growing file of complaints and testimonies. Each story represented a person whose life had been affected by the same systemic problems that had led to his own arrest. He thought about the path that had brought him here, from a young man with limited opportunities to a successful businessman with the resources to fight injustice. But he also thought about all the people who faced the same treatment he had received without the luxury of community support, media attention, or expensive lawyers. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "This is Terrence Washington." "Mr. Washington, my name is David Harrison." Terrence's breath caught. It was the officer who had arrested him, the man whose actions had set this entire chain of events in motion. "Officer Harrison," Terrence said carefully, "I'm surprised to hear from you." "Mr. Washington," Harrison's voice was strained, almost pleading, "I need to talk to you, not through lawyers or media, just person to person. I think there are some things you need to know about what really happened that day." Terrence considered the request for a moment. Every instinct told him to hang up, to let his lawyers handle any communication with the officers involved. But something in Harrison's voice, desperation, maybe even remorse, made him pause. "What kind of things?" Terrence asked. "Things about the department, about orders I received before your arrest, about why I was really there that day." The revelation hit Terrence like a physical blow. There had been orders? Someone had directed Harrison to his building? "Officer Harrison," Terrence said slowly, "if you want to talk, it needs to be on the record, with my attorney present." "I understand," Harrison replied. "Mr. Washington, I know you have no reason to believe me, but I need you to know that what happened to you, it wasn't random, and it goes higher up than you think." As Terrence hung up the phone, he realized that his arrest might not have been the result of simple racial bias or poor policing. It might have been something much more deliberate and much more dangerous. The investigation that had started with 2 officers and a wrongful arrest was about to uncover corruption that reached into the highest levels of Springfield's government. The meeting was arranged for 8 p.m. at Jerome Martinez's law office, chosen for its neutral location and the security cameras that would document everything said. Terrence Washington sat across from Officer David Harrison, their first face-to-face encounter since the arrest 4 days earlier. The contrast between them was stark. Terrence in his customary business attire, composed and alert, while Harrison appeared haggard and nervous in civilian clothes. Jerome had set up recording equipment with Harrison's consent, while FBI agent Maria Santos observed from a corner chair. The presence of federal law enforcement seemed to weigh heavily on the disgraced officer, whose career was already effectively over. "Mr. Washington," Harrison began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you could get me killed." The dramatic statement hung in the air like smoke. Agent Santos leaned forward slightly, her professional instincts recognizing the tone of someone about to confess to serious crimes. "Officer Harrison," Jerome said formally, "you've waived your right to have an attorney present. You understand that anything you say here is being recorded and can be used in legal proceedings?" Harrison nodded grimly. "I understand, and I need to tell the truth before this goes any further." He looked directly at Terrence, his pale eyes showing an emotion that might have been guilt or fear. "Your arrest wasn't random, Mr. Washington. I was ordered to go to your building that day." Terrence felt his stomach tighten but kept his expression neutral. "Ordered by whom?" "Sergeant Frank Morrison," Harrison replied. "He called me and Sullivan that morning, told us to respond to Sterling Electronics for a disturbance call. But when we got there, there was no disturbance. The store manager seemed confused about why we were there." Agent Santos spoke for the first time. "Officer Harrison, are you saying you were given false information to justify responding to Mr. Washington's building?" Harrison's hands shook slightly as he reached for the water glass Jerome had provided. "I'm saying we were set up to encounter Mr. Washington. Morrison knew his schedule, knew he visited his properties on the first Tuesday of every month." The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. What had appeared to be a case of racial profiling was beginning to look like a deliberate conspiracy. "Why?" Terrence asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Why would Sergeant Morrison want me arrested?" Harrison took a shaky breath before continuing. 3 months ago, you filed a complaint with the city about code violations in the apartment building next to your Washington building. The building is owned by Morrison's brother-in-law, Tony Castellano. Terrence remembered the complaint. The adjacent building was in terrible condition, with broken windows, faulty plumbing, and electrical problems that posed a fire hazard. As a responsible property owner, he had reported the violations to the city's code enforcement department. Morrison came to me and Sullivan about 6 weeks ago, Harrison continued. He said you were becoming a problem, sticking your nose into business that didn't concern you. He wanted you taken down a notch. Jerome was taking rapid notes, while Agent Santos recorded everything on a digital device. Officer Harrison, you're describing a criminal conspiracy. Are you prepared to testify to these facts under oath? Yes, Harrison said without hesitation. I'm tired of being part of a corrupt system. What we did to Mr. Washington was wrong, and it was illegal. Terrence leaned forward, his business instincts taking over. Tell me about Tony Castellano. What's his relationship to the police department? Harrison's laugh was bitter and humorless. Castellano owns half the rental properties in the low-income neighborhoods. Most of them are slums, but he has protection from code enforcement because of his connection to Morrison. The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Terrence had stumbled into a web of corruption that connected police leadership to slumlords who exploited the city's most vulnerable residents. How many other officers are involved? Agent Santos asked. Morrison runs what he calls his protection squad, Harrison explained. About 8 officers who handle special situations for people who pay the right price. We were told that legitimate businessmen sometimes needed to be reminded of their place in the community. Terrence felt a chill run down his spine. He had been targeted not just because of his race, but because his success and civic engagement threatened a criminal enterprise operating within the police department. Officer Harrison, Jerome said, you realize that by admitting to this conspiracy, you're confessing to federal crimes? Harrison nodded slowly. I know. But I also know that if I don't come clean now, this goes deeper and more people get hurt. Mr. Washington, you have resources and media attention. Most of Morrison's targets don't. Agent Santos stood up, her expression grim. Officer Harrison, I'm going to need you to come to our field office tomorrow to make a formal statement. We'll also need you to wear a wire during any future contacts with Sergeant Morrison or other conspirators. The meeting continued for another hour, with Harrison providing details about the corruption scheme that had operated for years within the Springfield Police Department. By the time they finished, it was clear that Terrence's arrest was just the tip of an iceberg that extended throughout the city's power structure. As Harrison prepared to leave, he turned back to Terrence. Mr. Washington, I know this doesn't undo what I did to you, but I hope it helps prevent it from happening to others. Terrence studied the officer's face, seeing genuine remorse mixed with fear. Officer Harrison, the question isn't whether this undoes what happened. The question is whether you're brave enough to see this through to the end. After Harrison left, Terrence, Jerome, and Agent Santos remained in the conference room, the weight of the revelations settling over them like a heavy blanket. Mr. Washington, Agent Santos said, this case has just become much more complex. We're looking at potential RICO violations, conspiracy, civil rights crimes, and corruption that could involve dozens of people. Terrence nodded grimly. What does that mean for the investigation? It means this is going to take months, possibly years, to fully unravel, the FBI agent replied, and it means you could be in danger. If Morrison and his associates realize that Harrison has flipped, they might see you as a threat. Jerome looked up from his notes, his face pale. Terrence, maybe you should consider protective custody until this is resolved. But Terrence shook his head firmly. I'm not hiding. I've built my life in this community, and I'm not going to let corrupt police officers drive me into hiding. Agent Santos admired his courage, but worried about his safety. Mr. Washington, these people have demonstrated they're willing to abuse their authority to protect their interests. You need to be very careful. The next morning, Terrence arrived at his office to find Keisha Johnson waiting with a stack of newspapers and printouts from online news sites. The story had taken another dramatic turn overnight, as news of Harrison's cooperation with federal investigators had leaked to the media. "Mr. Washington," Keisha said, her voice tight with concern, "you need to see these headlines." The Chicago Tribune's front page read, "Police officer admits to conspiracy and wrongful arrest case." The Springfield Journal had gone with, "FBI investigates corruption in local police department." Cable news networks were already picking up the story, with legal experts speculating about the broader implications. But it was a smaller story in the local paper that caught Terrence's attention. A brief item reported that Tony Castellano had been arrested the previous night on federal charges related to housing fraud and bribery. The arrest suggested that the FBI's investigation was moving rapidly. Terrence's phone rang constantly throughout the morning as reporters sought comment on the developing story. He referred all calls to Jerome, preferring to let the legal process play out without interference from media speculation. At noon, Chief Sterling called requesting another meeting. This time, his tone was completely different from their previous conversations. "Mr. Washington," Sterling said, his voice heavy with exhaustion, "I need to ask for your help." "My help?" Terrence was genuinely surprised by the request. "The federal investigation has uncovered corruption that goes back years," Sterling explained. "I've been chief for 8 months, and I'm discovering that problems in this department run much deeper than I ever imagined." Terrence considered the chief's words carefully. Sterling had inherited a department with systemic problems, but he was now faced with the choice of covering up the corruption or helping to expose it. "Chief Sterling," Terrence said finally, "what kind of help are you asking for?" "I want to clean up this department," Sterling replied, "but I need community leaders like you to help rebuild trust. The federal consent decree is going to require civilian oversight, community input, and transparency that this department has never had before." Terrence was quiet for a long moment, considering the chief's request. It represented an opportunity to create lasting change, but it also meant working with the same institution that had violated his rights. "Chief Sterling," Terrence said finally, "I'll consider helping, but only under certain conditions. Complete transparency in the investigation, full cooperation with federal authorities, and a commitment to systemic reform, not just cosmetic changes." "You have my word," Sterling replied, and for the first time since this ordeal began, Terrence heard something in the chief's voice that sounded like genuine commitment to justice. As Terrence hung up the phone, he realized that his wrongful arrest had become something much larger than personal vindication. It had become a catalyst for fundamental change in how his community was policed. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since this began, Terrence felt like they might actually win. 2 weeks after Officer Harrison's shocking confession, the Springfield Police Department looked like a war zone. FBI agents occupied 3 offices on the 2nd floor, boxes of evidence lined the hallways, and the steady stream of officers being escorted out in handcuffs had become a daily spectacle that local news crews captured with grim efficiency. Sergeant Frank Morrison sat in Interview Room B, his once commanding presence reduced to that of a cornered animal. His expensive suit, paid for with bribes from slumlords and drug dealers, now seemed like a costume from a previous life. Across the metal table, FBI agent Maria Santos and federal prosecutor James Mitchell reviewed the evidence that would likely send him to prison for decades. "Sergeant Morrison," Agent Santos began, her voice professionally neutral, "we have recorded conversations, financial records, and testimony from 7 officers who participated in your conspiracy. You can cooperate now, or you can face the full weight of federal prosecution." Morrison's lawyer, a criminal defense attorney named Robert Blake, who specialized in police corruption cases, leaned forward. "My client is prepared to discuss a plea agreement in exchange for his full cooperation." The admission sent shockwaves through the room. Morrison had been the architect of the corruption scheme that had targeted Terrence Washington, but his cooperation would expose a network of corruption that extended far beyond the police department. Meanwhile, across town in his office, Terrence Washington was meeting with a delegation of community leaders who had been inspired by his fight for justice. The group included Pastor James Williams from the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Maria Rodriguez from the Latino Community Center, Dr. Sarah Kim from the Asian American Business Association, and several other prominent citizens. "Mr. Washington," Pastor Williams began, his deep voice carrying the authority of someone who had led civil rights struggles for decades, "what you've accomplished here goes beyond your personal case. You've given this entire community hope that we can fight back against injustice." Terrence looked around the conference table at faces that represented the diversity of Springfield's population. These were people who had experienced their own encounters with police misconduct, discrimination, and systemic bias, but had lacked the resources to fight back effectively. "Pastor Williams," Terrence replied, "this fight isn't about me anymore. It's about creating a system where everyone in this community gets equal treatment under the law." Dr. Kim pulled out a folder containing petition signatures. "We've been organizing since your arrest. Over 3,000 residents have signed petitions demanding police reform, civilian oversight, and accountability for officers who abuse their authority." Maria Rodriguez added, "The Latino community has been dealing with harassment and illegal searches for years. Your case has given people the courage to come forward with their own stories." As they spoke, Jerome Martinez burst into the office, his face flushed with excitement and exhaustion. He had been working 18-hour days coordinating with federal investigators, civil rights attorneys, and community organizations. "Terrence," Jerome announced, "Morrison just agreed to cooperate with the FBI. He's going to testify about the entire corruption network." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Morrison's cooperation would expose not just police corruption, but the web of politicians, businessmen, and city officials who had enabled and profited from the system. "What does that mean for the broader investigation?" Dr. Kim asked. Jerome consulted his notes, his voice taking on the professional tone he used when delivering complex legal information. "It means we're looking at potential charges against the deputy mayor, 3 city council members, 2 judges, and at least 12 businesses that were paying for police protection." Pastor Williams whistled low. "Lord have mercy. This thing goes all the way to the top." Terrence stood and walked to his window, looking down at Commerce Street where his ordeal had begun 2 weeks earlier. The street looked the same, but everything had changed. His arrest had pulled back the curtain on a system of corruption that had operated in the shadows for years. "Jerome," Terrence said, "what about the other victims? The people who were harassed, arrested, or had their businesses targeted by this conspiracy?" "We're identifying them now," Jerome replied. "The FBI has opened what they're calling Operation Clean Sweep. They're reviewing every arrest, every complaint, and every interaction involving the officers who were part of Morrison's network." Dr. Kim leaned forward, her expression intense. "Mr. Washington, we need to talk about what comes next. The federal investigation will eventually end, but we need to make sure the changes are permanent." This was the question that had been weighing on Terrence's mind. How do you transform a moment of crisis into lasting institutional change? "I've been thinking about that," Terrence said, returning to his seat. "We need to create independent oversight mechanisms that can't be corrupted or controlled by the same people who created the problems." Pastor Williams nodded approvingly. "Community control of police accountability. That's what we've been fighting for in other cities." Maria Rodriguez pulled out her phone, showing them a news article. "Chicago just implemented a civilian oversight board with subpoena power and independent investigators. Maybe we could use that as a model." As the meeting continued, they began planning a comprehensive reform agenda that would go far beyond punishment for corrupt officers. They talked about community policing, bias training, economic development in neglected neighborhoods, and educational programs that would help young people understand their rights. But their planning was interrupted by an urgent knock on the door. Keisha Johnson entered, her face pale with worry. "Mr. Washington," she said, her voice tight with concern, "you need to see this." She turned on the television in the conference room, tuning to the local news channel. The breaking news banner read, "Death threats target businessman at center of police corruption probe." The reporter's voice filled the room with disturbing news. Sources close to the investigation tell us that Terrence Washington, the Springfield businessman whose wrongful arrest exposed widespread police corruption, has been receiving death threats. The FBI is treating the threats as credible and has increased security around key witnesses in the case. The room erupted in concerned voices as community leaders expressed their outrage and fear. Terrence held up his hand for silence, his expression calm but determined. "This doesn't change anything," he said firmly. "If anything, it proves that we're getting close to the truth. People don't make death threats unless they're desperate." Jerome was already on his phone with Agent Santos, coordinating security measures. "Terrence, the FBI wants to assign protective detail to you and your family members." "I don't have family members to protect," Terrence replied. "And I'm not going into hiding, but I appreciate the FBI's concern." Pastor Williams stood up, his imposing figure radiating righteous anger. "Mr. Washington, you're not alone in this fight. Our community will stand with you." Dr. Kim nodded emphatically. "The Asian American Business Association will provide security volunteers. We have members who are former military and law enforcement. The Latino Community Center has connections with neighborhood watch groups throughout the city," Maria Rodriguez added. "We can coordinate community protection." As they planned Terrence's security, Agent Santos called Jerome with urgent news. Morrison's cooperation had already yielded arrests of 2 city council members and a municipal judge who had been taking bribes to dismiss cases against preferred defendants. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. "Jerome," Agent Santos said over the phone, her voice carrying across the room through the speaker, "Morrison just admitted that the plan to arrest Mr. Washington was approved by Deputy Mayor Kevin Thompson. This conspiracy goes all the way to the mayor's office." The room fell silent as the full scope of the corruption became clear. What had started with 2 racist officers had revealed a system of corruption that infected the highest levels of Springfield's government.